What's going on, everybody? Wednesday mini stream. Good to have you here. Tree anatomy. This is the basis of the formation of our vocabulary and our vernacular with which we're able to communicate about bonsai. And I think it is extremely important to start off the discussion of bonsai understanding what is this terminology? What is the terminology that we hear from a Japanese perspective? What is the translation and the terminology as it is adapted to bonsai culture outside of Japan and the English equivalent? And what does it actually all mean across all of the different species that we utilize in bonsai, or at least across the different genres of tree species that we utilize in bonsai? Let us dig in and dissect tree anatomy and really kind of discuss across those different species and genres the way that these similar pieces of vocabulary interact, okay? So let's begin. Now, I have here sitting on a turntable a deciduous tree. Deciduous tree, when we talk about deciduous, the broader term for deciduous is a broadleaf tree. Because we are going to have a broader leaf, it's going to be thinner, it's going to be of high water mobility. So our deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall and stay leafless over the winter time are deciduous, but all deciduous trees are broadleaf trees. Okay, there's a few exceptions, we won't tap into that today. Just abide by that deciduous trees are broadleaf. Now, inside of the broadleaf category, we also have broadleafed evergreens. We're gonna look at that second, but we have a deciduous tree on the turntable. The species, it's a ginkgo biloba, a maidenhair tree. Very, very interesting tree. It's a dinosaur if we talk about its prehistoric nature and origins. Anyways, deciduous is the focal point in terms of anatomical beginnings, right? Now we have the container, the ceramic vessel. We understand the ceramic vessel is what makes a bonsai a bonsai. Any tree can be a bonsai, but we recognize that once you put that tree or shrub into a shallow confined environment with the purpose of constricting the space with which that tree can grow, we get a reduction of internodes, we get a reduction of leaf size, we get a reduction of pace and rate of growth, which makes it possible for us to manage the aesthetic of the tree. It's the vessel that makes it a bonsai, okay? The merging of the vessel to the tree is filled with soil. And when we start to talk about the soil that we utilize in bonsai, we're talking about specific soils that are more aggregate in nature than organic in nature. And the aggregate aspect of these soils allows them to hold less water, but more importantly, have more oxygen space between the particles. Because we are cultivating the tree in a shallow environment, we have a reduced gravity column, and we have a limited ability to remove water from that. We use an aggregate soil to cultivate the best balanced water and oxygen, which is what allows roots to grow. We have a top dressing on top of that soil, which protects the soil, balances and manages the loss of water, and really gives that bridge of an aesthetic from the container to the tree, which is the top dressing or the moss covering that grows on top of that top dressing. And then we get to the first real tree anatomy anatomical portion. And we don't necessarily see this across all species or across every tree in a species. But the beginning of the tree anatomy is known as the Nabari in Japanese terms. Nabari is the root spread or the root base, where we see strong structural roots provide a basal flare that gives us the impression of stability, that gives us the impression of a strong stance or anchored status of the tree with the earth, or the tree with the soil line, or the tree with the ground, if you will. So the Nabari is the spread of those primary roots, those strong structural roots. Not tiny, small, fine roots, but actually getting into the woody structure of the tree, giving us that spread. Now we said it doesn't necessarily exist on every tree. Every tree can have a Nabari, but not every tree will have a Nabari. And that is to say the potential for that basal spread is there in any species we work with in bonsai. But sometimes trees don't have that structure in the way that they've developed over the course of time. And so there will be pines that have a Nabari, and there will be pines that do not have a Nabari, because that structure in terms of the tree did not develop with the way it was growing and the circumstances that created it. As we rise up from the Nabari, and when we talk, let me just backtrack one moment and just say, in the vernacular of Mirai, we don't really talk about Nabari, rarely if at all. What we would utilize instead of Nabari is the base. The base as a common term. The root base, more specifically, but the base of the tree where we get the visual reference of what the rootage looks like, what the tree's inherent capacity to visually grip the ground is, and how we lean on base as a substitute for Nabari to drive our asymmetrical design and the representation of age, okay? So now when we move up from base, we get into this sort of lower 30% of the trunk that in Japan they call it the tachiagari, right? This is basically sort of the upright lower portion of the trunk. And when we start to look at this, I basically, and in the terminology of Mirai, we tend to call the tachiagari the lower portion of the trunk. Very simple, very effortless to understand, but necessary to draw those differentiations of the terminology. And when we think about bonsai design, the lower portion of the trunk, or the tachiagari, as that trunk rises up from that root base and starts to take on characteristics not of roots, but of actual physical stem or trunk, right? That is where in every single tree's design, we are always going to want to emphasize and draw attention to that location. The tachiagari is our first impression of trunk, our first impression of the quality of line in movement, the first insinuation of direction as that tree exits the root mass and enters into that primary piece of design, the trunk line, okay? Now, as we follow the trunk line up the tree, and this particular piece is very, very straight, we don't necessarily have movement or trunk movement or changes of direction that are occurring here. We will see other trees that do have that characteristic. In this instance, the anatomy of the trunk is formally upright, right? And that formal upright, that dead straight perpendicular line in contrast to the rim of the container, definitely a style, a characteristic, and a nuance that coincides with the design of specific species and specific natural growth habits. When we look at the very top of where the vegetative mass ends, the very top of this is the apex. This is the apical region, the highest structural point that holds vegetative growth. The apical region of each species has a different construct, a different reasons for its shape and its anatomy. And when we get into the actual aesthetic execution of bonsai, we dive into all of those different things that guide the process and the creation of the apex. And the other thing that we will see anatomically in terms of this tree is this transition of thickness from a very thick to an intermediate size to a thinner size as the vocabulary term of taper. This is the transition from thick to thin and the gradation from the trunk to the branching to the finest tips that allows us to see that natural transition of form and shape in a miniaturized scale. When we look at the branching anatomically as a vocabulary term is a very broad brushstroke. There are specifics inside of branching that allow us to orient in our bonsai practice. Any piece that originates from the trunk, from the primary line of our design, any piece that originates from the trunk is a primary branch, right? This is a branch, again, emerging from the trunk. That does not refer to its girth. That does not refer to any sort of habit that we form around primary branching. It just simply references a primary branch emerges from the trunk. And that primary branch is also termed the structure of the tree, right? Structural branches are primary branches. Structural pieces are the trunk and primary branches. And when we talk about primary branches, the structural pieces emerging from the trunk, that is how we sum up that vocabulary. Now, some of us look at these growing vertically and we say, is that a primary branch or is that a trunk? This is open to discussion and aesthetic discretion. Because if I handle this in the manner in which I create primary branches off of this upright piece, secondary branches off of my primary branches, and an apical region, I have just treated that piece coming off the trunk as if it were a sub-trunk in the design of that bonsai. If I bend it down and I create a branch pad, a layout of foliar mass that references a singular positive space or a single mass of foliar, a single foliar mass. Now I've turned it into a branch. And subjectively, I've made a decision to delineate trunk or branch. But a trunk can emerge from the base, from the soil, and also in subcompartments as we work our way up that primary line of the trunk, and they become subtrunks, okay? So we have primary, maybe handled as a trunk, maybe handled as a branch. We decide on that. We have those components coming off of structure, and once we see that primary structural piece, that primary branch divide, that is the division from primary to secondary branching. These become secondary branching, okay? And if we further move out our secondaries and they divide again, these become tertiary branching. So we see primary emerging from the trunk, we see secondary branches emerging from primary, we see tertiary branches emerging from secondary, and that is our natural gradation and step down of ramification as a big, broad vocabulary term, the creation of as many branches with this hierarchical step down and transition of taper to create this greater image of a tree in a miniaturized form, right? So we're talking deciduous, we're talking all of the fundamental terms, and we're talking about that transition through the branching, okay? I'm gonna move on to a broadleaf piece because we're gonna see a broadleaf evergreen piece because we're gonna see the same terminology and it's gonna look very, very different, okay? Okay, this is a broadleafed evergreen, which is to say in the wintertime, it does not shed all of its leaves. Now, it will shed a significant number of its leaves, but it will not shed all of its leaves, evergreen. But it is broadleaf. The leaf is large, broad, thin, and has a high water mobility. This particular tree, coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia, and this is a very interesting broadleafed evergreen tree. In the traditional form of bonsai, we just saw the deciduous piece, and in that deciduous piece, we did not see any deadwood. But when we get into broadleafed evergreens, and especially when we get into coniferous bonsai, deadwood starts to become a very major feature on this tree. Now, this is a perfect illustration of a tree that does not have a Nabari. If we just start from the very bottom and work our way up, we do not have a Nabari. We don't see that basal spread. We definitely have a base of the trunk, but we don't see that flare of the structural rootage giving rise to sort of that buttress that we would call the Nabari or the base of the tree. Instead, we have a large mass of wood that we're referencing as the base, right? And this gives us our impression of stability, but we are lacking in this. You notice we're lacking that transition. That is something to be aware of and recognize Nabari is not present in this tree. The base is actually the beginning as the trunk, okay? As we work up into this, we see this area of deadwood. We have live wood along the margins of this. Living tissue, still growing, still actively adding. Living tissue is the conductor of water and the conductor of sugars and starches from the root mass of the tree that's contained in this container to the foliar mass of the tree that is photosynthesizing. Okay, so this living tissue on the margins is conducting resources. This dead area in here, this is what's left behind. When death has occurred, the tree has compartmentalized the damage, and the outer bark of the tree has eroded, leaving or giving rise to the interior wood structure being shown. It's not holding water, it's not moving water, and it's not actively growing. It is effectively dead. But it is still a part of the tree, and it is a valuable part of the tree to express age. When we see trunk with deadwood, this is known as shari. Okay? Shari is a Japanese term that literally means dead trunk. Okay? So we can have shari that runs the entire length of the trunk, or we can have shari that just occurs in a singular location. In this instance, we see the shari covering almost the entire front portion of the trunk, right? We recognize that we have movement in this trunk, changes of direction to the left, to the right, to the left again. This is trunk movement, or this is also a conversation about the trunk line. What is the trunk line? The changes of direction that occur as we move from the base to the upper canopy of the tree. We see taper working through the branches. We see primary branching originating from the trunk. We see secondaries emerging from primaries. We see tertiaries emerging from secondaries. We have all of our portions of ramification present in the branches of this piece. Beyond that, we see an apex that has a much different form than the previous deciduous model. This is an apex that's representative of more of a oak-shaped form, a big, broad, billowy canopy. And you can see that the apex is comprised of a lot of different pieces of ramification. It's not a singular branch. It is an area or region of the tree that caps off the design and gives us our final opportunity to generate asymmetry. So inside of this piece, we've now added shari. We've now discussed live wood versus dead wood, and we've seen some of the same vocabulary trickle through in terms of tree anatomy in the broadleafed evergreen genre. Okay, let's move on to the conifers. I'm going to set this one aside. Okay, this is a pine, just an absolutely splendid pine. And when we talk about pine, there are multiple varieties of pine that we use in bonsai. Pinus is the Latin name for the overarching genre, defined by the very thin, often triangular if you roll it in your fingers, sometimes flat depending on the species, and sometimes round shape of the needle-like form, okay? And when we talk about pine, we have multi-flush pine, short needle single flush pine, long needle single flush pine, and we're now working on outlier pines. These are pine quantifications of species that behave in specific ways, and we'll go on to define that a little bit later, okay? Now when we look at pine, again, this concept of base, the Nabari, this tree has a very pronounced Nabari. But there's value inside of this tree's Nabari in terms of learning about the vernacular and vocabulary. Because not only do we have Nabari in terms of that basal flare, just below the lower portion of the trunk or the tachiagari, we also see that we have primary pieces of root mass, again, primary branching, primary roots. The same thing that happens in the canopy also happens in the lower portion of the tree. They are mirror reflections of each other. We have primary roots. From the primary roots, we have secondary roots forming. And from the secondary roots, we see tertiary roots in this design. Okay, this is not common necessarily. This is not something that we see often, to have this gradient breakdown of the root mass be visible. But for this tree, it's a major feature visually, and it allows us to dissect and understand the vocabulary of how the root structure itself transitions and tapers from thick to moderate to thinner pieces of growth. We have the lower trunk present, and we see the beginning of deadwood as it occurs. That deadwood on the trunk, again, shari. Shari is the name, and we still use the Japanese term for deadwood on the trunk as shari. It's a very easy reference to understand location, form, and what's happening. Okay, we see the living tissue working around the shari, and when we see this living tissue, you'll notice the margin of this living tissue has kind of an orange coloration to it. Okay, that's what we call callus. And when we talk about callus, callus is the production of young new tissue that is actually compartmentalizing, healing, and callus is the vascular growth of that trunk, of the water-conducting pieces of xylem and phloem, creating new tissue to be able to accommodate an expanding needle mass. Callus is not a magical, singularly occurring piece of growth. It is part of the natural, consistent creation and accumulation of wood, of vascular tissue, of the tree's trunk and branching, right? All of those things have similarities in terms of their meaning and intention, right? So we see the shari or the deadwood on the trunk, we see the living tissue, we see the callus forming as an extension and expansion of the living tissue, and we see the bark, right? Now there was bark on the broadleafed evergreen, there was bark on the deciduous tree, but we see really pronounced bark when we start getting into some of our species that have a cork cambium, or the bark-producing meristem, okay? And this bark is dead. At its creation, the bark is created as a dead piece of tissue, which makes it very unique. Its design is to protect the tree from desiccation, from blowing, eroding, debris in the wind, to resist fires, to resist moisture loss. It is a very important barrier for trees that produce thicker bark. Thicker bark trees typically can tolerate more harsh conditions, okay? But beyond that, the bark of a tree is a major indicator of age, because bark is very slow to accumulate, is very slow to amass on the tree, and therefore trees with very pronounced old, fissured, thick bark have a significant age. And that is where we derive a lot of our visual value in pine as bonsai. We have different types of movement in this tree, and this is where this tree is brilliant, and we talk about this a lot in the vernacular of Mirai. We have curvaceous movement, round movement, looser, more lobular changes of direction. Notice how that has a lot of radius to it, okay? But we also have angular movement in this tree, where we actually see the out protrusion of that angle. We see the more acute piece of movement, that more convincing change of direction and angularity to the form. So to understand that the trunk line the movement of the trunk as we move through the midsection and upper section, has different types of movement is a major thing to understand because that helps us derive information about how we design the tree. Again, we have primary branches emerging from the trunk, we have secondaries, and we have tertiaries. Okay, this exact same scenario, so again, we have primary, we have secondaries, we have tertiaries, right? The step-down effect is the same, whether it's a conifer, whether it's deciduous, whether it's broadleafed evergreen. We have the formation of our apical region as the highest foliar mass on the tree. All of our different components in terms of the actual anatomy of the tree are present. But there's one more piece of anatomy I want to focus on with this tree specifically, and that is the sashieda, or the defining branch. Okay, now, Japanese terms, sashieda, right? The branch that creates the character. It's not the ichieda. Ichieda, the number one branch, oftentimes in traditional design, is the longest, right? I'm going to say that when we talk sashieda, the branch that gives character, the branch that creates the spirit of the tree, this also gives rise to the greatest degree of asymmetry. So we're going to combine ichieda with sashieda, and we're going to call that the defining branch, the branch that creates the character and the branch that gives rise to the asymmetry. So when we look at this tree, the sashieda, the ichieda, the combination of those two Japanese terms equaling the defining branch is this branch right here, because it is the longest branch from the physical mass of the foliar canopy. The entirety of all needles creates the foliar canopy. This is the branch that creates the interest. This is the branch that creates the asymmetrical direction. This becomes my defining branch in design. A major component when you combine the movement of the trunk with the length of the defining branch and the orientation of the apex, these three things combine to create design field. This is how we decide, how we elicit a response from the viewer of our tree. Okay? Pine bonsai, pine anatomy, a lot of different pieces that we're seeing piggyback on these different genres, but also some nuances to each species that allow us to expand the conversation. Okay, last one. Again, this is my first bonsai tree from when I was 12 years old. Still alive. I'm very, very proud of it. Okay? A juniper. Now, I think junipers probably create the most interesting vernacular and vocabulary for the pursuit of bonsai because they have such an emphasis placed on the contrast of the living and the dead. We say the living and the dead, so we recognize here is our Nabari, or here is our base, where we get that flare. We don't necessarily have it on this side, but we have it very pronounced to one side. So a one-sided Nabari or a one-sided base gives us a lot of visual information about the direction this tree is leaning and how we visually support a potential design we would create, okay? We have the deadwood along the trunk, again, shari, running from the very base of the tree all the way up through the top of the tree. That is entirely shari because it is deadwood on the trunk. When we're talking about the juniper, we talked about the callus formation on the pine. Here is our callus formation on the juniper. But when we get into juniper bonsai, we do start to delineate the living tissue, or what we call the live vein. You notice the live vein here. This is living. This is conducting water. This is conducting sugars and starches. This is where all of the movement from the roots to the foliar mass exists. Okay, now it's contrasted to the shari, the deadwood. This is not conducting water. It is still a part of the tree. It grew and then died at a time in this tree's life. No longer conducting. Living vein, still conducting resources. And that living vein has to connect to the foliar mass of the tree and has to connect to the roots. It is the bridge that allows resources to move through the trunk of the tree. So in junipers, the combination of living vein and deadwood creates the trunk. And the contrast of the living tissue against the dead tissue creates the aesthetic value. This is part of the anatomy of a juniper specifically. Now, as we work up the tree, I see these dead branches, right? And we have shari being the dead trunk. Dead branches are called jin, J-I-N, jin, right? So when we think about shari and we think about jin, these are both deadwood features. Both deadwood features. Shari is deadwood on the trunk, jin is a dead branch, okay? Both of them are deadwood, but they have different names to delineate their locations. And as we move up into the upper canopy of the tree, you'll see where shari actually transitions into jin, where we make this change from the trunk to now the trunk breaking off into branches and all of these pieces being dead. So we have that natural cadence to the transition into primary, secondary, tertiary. Very rarely, if ever, have I heard somebody, and we've never done it, mention primary gin, secondary gin, tertiary gin. But there are discussions about how far do we carry the detail of Deadwood out onto the gin, right? That might become a discussion that we hear. Again, if we talk about the anatomy of design, we have our satiata, or our defining branch right here, giving rise to the asymmetry and the direction of flow that the foliar mass is giving us. We have our apex as the highest foliar load, okay? And when we start to talk about the creation or the anatomy of bonsai design, notice how we have delineated masses of positive space represented by the needles, okay? These are called pads. These are pads inside of bonsai design, okay? Now we have the ability to make big pads or small pads, to unify pads or divide pads. We have subdivision or definitive division of our pads. These are all ways that we handle the branching system to be able to divide and create space and scale and proportion and distribution of foliar mass, okay? All of these pieces have to photosynthesize, and our design has to create sustainable design in terms of allowing each branch the space and light to be able to sustainably exist and contribute to the sugar starch storage of the tree. Inside of that, we have so many meshings of design and horticulture that we have to consider. That's what makes bonsai complex. It's also what makes bonsai beautiful, okay? So we start to recognize that my defining branch as a primary piece originates from the trunk up there, that I have a secondary branch that has created a separate pad. I have another secondary branch over here that has created another pad, and I've divided my secondary branches here to break up this larger piece into two separate pads. Automatically, just by looking at anatomy, we start to take on cues of how do I create multiple pads from a single primary branch. You space out your secondaries to give them their own opportunity and division from that primary branch. That is how we create pad division, right? So it becomes this really beautiful observational tool when we talk about anatomy. We started with deciduous trees, and we didn't speak about Deadwood very commonly. We talked about those very basic forms of Nabari, trunk, primary, secondary, tertiary. We went to the broadleafed evergreen. We saw the beginning of shari, living tissue, and Deadwood. We then moved on to the pine. We saw Nabari, secondary, tertiary root mass. We saw shari, we saw callus, right? We saw the beginning of the defining branch, and we moved on to the juniper, where we really focused on live vein, Deadwood, shari, gin, and we focused on the secondary branching as being a point of origination for the division of pads or the foliar masses that occupy positive space in design. These are your very fundamental components that we begin the dialogue, the discussion of, and the process of learning the vernacular of Mirai and all the techniques we utilize to both cultivate bonsai as well as design them in a really visually attractive way. Thank you all for the support. We'll keep rocking. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you tomorrow, if not next Tuesday. Mwah!